Welcome to the Everything Apartments Podcast. I'm your host, Eric Christopher. I'm president of WSC Realty Advisors here in Long Beach, California, where I've been an apartment broker, owner, and property manager for the last 15 years. This podcast covers all aspects of multifamily investments, from buying and financing properties. We also cover day-to-day operations and management, and then into reinvestment strategies to increase your net worth, which is where we'll be today. Also, I wanted to remind you, if you're listening or viewing for the first time, we have a nice collection of back episodes that you can find easily inside Apple Podcasts or Spotify. And I'm sure if you went back and just kind of take a look at those, I'm sure there'll be some topics in there that would be interesting to you as well. So we have a great show with a great guest today. So let's get right into it. So let's go through a classic progression as an apartment owner. Let's say you're a long-term owner. You could have 1, 2, or 10 buildings for that matter. It doesn't really matter. You're basically ready to retire from an active ownership and move to a passive ownership. And let's say also you've done multiple 1031 exchanges to get where you are today. You've got a ton of gain built up in this equation. You've got a ton of depreciation credited against the properties. And oh, by the way, the depreciation's run out a long time ago. You probably aren't going to sell outright. Some do, very rare, but most that think they will, they don't execute that strategy after they get a projection of their tax bill from their CPA, looking at that huge number and cringing. I've talked to a lot of owners over the years that literally tell me, and the first time I heard this, I said, "What did these guys just say?" They say they're just going to wait around to die and they'll get the stepped up basis and their kids can handle it, which seems a little reckless depending on who the kids are. The other avenue is the 1031 exchange into something else. And if it's going to be passive, classically, that's been a discussion around single tenant, triple net leased investments, like a Taco Bell store, which is under a long-term lease with no owner management. Most owners and investors have heard of those. But there is another very viable option to explore, which is the DST, and that stands for Delaware Statutory Trust. With us today is Matthew McFarland with the firm K Properties. K Properties is a leading DST brokerage offering services in all 50 states. They're located here in Southern California, by the way. Since joining K Properties, our guest, Matthew McFarland, has participated in over 800 transactions, totaling over $200 million of investor equity placement and $9.5 billion worth of investment real estate. Those are some good looking numbers. A graduate of the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA Bruin, Matt holds a Bachelor of Science in Physiological Science from the Department of Integrative Biology and Physiology. Matt is a native of the South Bay area here in LA and currently enjoys living with his wife, Erica, in Redondo Beach. Great spot for sure. Matt, it's a pleasure having you with us today.
Thanks, Eric. Really appreciate being part of the show.
Great. So you're a proud UCLA Bruin alum. I have to say you have a very interesting degree of study. Give us a quick kind of post-college or college tour of how you ended up in the investment real estate industry.
Absolutely. And first off, I want to say go Bruins. The real estate world seems to be dominated by Trojans in Southern California. So
sure
very proud, very, very proud to be a Bruin. It was always my dream school. So had the best 4 years ever there. But in terms of my journey, it's been a little bit different. I would say going back to my childhood, my father is an emergency room physician. My family owns a nutrition business in the South Bay. Always had an affinity for the human body, sports and athletics, and it just seemed to be the right fit for me. Didn't really question it, and entered UCLA with a very rigorous course load, and actually made it all the way through with a physiology degree. Took the MCAT exam, hundreds of hours of service in the hospital to present myself as a candidate for various medical schools. And I had this moment at the end of my junior year where I really took a good hard look at my future and questioned if this was the path that I wanted to continue on. As many people know, medical school is very costly. It's a very time-intensive career that you really can't get out of too easily once you kind of start that process. So long story short, started to look at different opportunities. I've always been fascinated with investment real estate, and between actually my junior and senior year at that time, I happened to have an internship with K Properties, which is kind of what began our relationship. So that really exposed me to the real estate world. Found everything about it so interesting. I love connecting with clients. I love learning. And Eric, I'm sure you enjoy this aspect of your job too, just learning and meeting with people, hearing their stories, building relationships is an amazing part of the real estate world. And so actually took my first job out of school down in Orange County, working for a medium-sized tenant representation firm. It's kind of where I cut my teeth, learned the business, got recruited to come back to K Properties through this pre-existing relationship about 4 years ago. And it's been just an amazing journey. And I'm so blessed to be where I am today.
No, great to hear it. And you're exactly right. One of the best things about this industry, and I've been 15 years, maybe a little more at this point, you're never stopping learning. You're always able to figure out new things, different investor ideas, different financing mechanisms. Like, that's half the fun for me is just exploring and continuing to explore this vast industry that is commercial real estate. So many investors and brokers and our whole commercial investment real estate industry is built around the 1031 exchange. And, it's been there forever. It's been a wonderful mechanism to accumulate growth and prosperity. I've heard in my career, probably like you have a couple times, that there'd be news that there was going to be some structural changes to that. Now, I don't know about you. I'm more concerned that there will be now under Biden than maybe the previous discussions that I've heard over 15 years. What are your thoughts on the changes to the 1031 exchange mechanism under Biden? I mean, where do you see it going?
Yeah, it's really a good question, and a lot of investors have been wondering that same thing. And I would agree with you that under today's administration, there has been more of a threat of the 1031 changing than probably ever before. It is not uncommon that the 1031 exchange is challenged. As you mentioned, it has been a part of the tax code. People don't realize, going all the way back to 1921. So it's a century-old part of the tax code and is so vital to the real estate industry as a whole. What Biden's camp originally proposed was not a complete kind of getting rid of the 1031 exchange, but more so amending the 1031 exchange to put a limit on the different values that can be exchanged. There's been, quite honestly, very, very little talk of it since he's taken office. And very recently, actually, this was just last Wednesday, the Senate passed their initial $3.5 trillion budget plan resolution. And one of the amendments that was made as part of that resolution, the 1031 exchange has enormous implications on employment and economic opportunities for this country. It's the reason why investors can trade up through the deferral of those taxes. So not to say that it couldn't be threatened, in the future. It probably will continue to be something that is discussed, but very recently, a huge win for the real estate industry. And it seems like, at least for the time being, everything will stay maintained.
Yeah, it'd be nice if it ended up just kind of being one of those false alarms that we've seen, in my career, I've seen 3, 4, 5 times. And, I spoke with a really great enrolled agent a couple episodes back. His thought was the same as yours, is it's not completely going away. There may be limitations that we don't have now, and possibly, that could span through a Biden administration and be unwound in the next one. So nothing's ever static. But for folks that, might have been thinking about doing something in the last couple of years, like maybe time to really think about that in the current scenario to be able to do that. So let's assume for our discussion that there isn't an imminent threat to the structural nature of the 1031 exchange. I spoke with owners for 15 years, and predominantly I get that they're very hands-on and they get used to the control of a single asset. And many would like to retire, but it's kind of a trust fall into doing something where they're not in control. So what are the major differences between 100% ownership and a control of an asset versus passive? I mean, basically, how do you address that when you talk to people? Like, they've got to be telling you kind of the same thing. Well, I'd like to do this, but I don't want to be left where I'm not in control. What do you tell them?
Definitely. Yeah. And you mentioned at the top of the call too, or the conversation, right, that the two passive options that investors really have for consideration are, exchanging into a triple net. That is something that they control 100% of. And I think the biggest hurdle, certainly the biggest hurdle that investors have to overcome is the control. Many investors are even thinking about doing an exchange in the first place is due to the fact that they have created wealth for their family through managing their apartment properties, right? So to move away from a place that has brought them so much financial success through their investments and through their control, it can certainly be a hurdle to overcome. And I think that's where the education is really important in understanding the pros and cons of the DSTs versus the triple nets. I think one of the largest benefits of the DST is the ability to diversify. So if we're working with an investor, let's say they're selling a property for $2.5 million and they have a $4 million net worth. This is a large portion of their nest egg. It would make sense potentially for them to diversify. And they can take that $2.5 million and spread it across 5 different DSTs. There's so much further I can go there, but I think the first major benefit would just be the diversification. And for some investors that makes sense and works really well. But certainly doesn't work well for everyone.
Let me ask you this, because over my career I've had numerous and kind of semi-steady discussions around TIC, a tenant in common. How does a DST and a TIC vary?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there are a lot of similarities. Both structures would qualify for 1031 exchange investment. The DST actually has a revenue code ruling that got passed in 2004. So it's been an official ruling for 17 years now. But the biggest differences, I would say, comes down to voting rights and comes down to the number of investors that are allowed to invest in one particular TIC or DST. So in a TIC, there is unanimous consent required for any major decision that is made on that particular investment. And as you can imagine, if there are 30 different investors that don't really know each other, they're coming from different stages and walks of life, different parts of the country, to get 30 people to all agree on one thing is very challenging. Your kind of pitfall of the tenant in common is getting to that unanimous consent. Whereas a DST, 100% of the decision-making authority is on the DST company. So the investors don't, have any active say or voice, and it makes it much easier to operate, the property from the beginning to, through the very end. So, and then on top of that, the TIC can accommodate 35 investors. So typically the minimums are a little bit higher, or a lot higher than DSTs are. So it allows for less diversification, whereas the DST structure can accommodate as many as 499 investors. So the minimums are typically a lot lower to allow for that diversification.
Okay, so maybe in its structural differences there, but the idea between the TIC and DST is both similar with its passive nature. You're able to select product type, you can diversify, and that is a concern, right? Because I've talked to like any commercial or investment broker over the years around this 1031 exchange into a single tenant. And a lot of times they'd be out of state to get the kind of returns that they're hoping for. All of a sudden, it just occurs to them, I'm putting a huge amount of my net worth into one bucket in a place I don't know. Who knows if this operator is going to be viable for a long period of time, et cetera. So you're giving, just like I read in your book, which is great, and I'll have that in the show notes. It's about spreading your eggs around, similar to the way you would invest in mutual funds or a portfolio, versus having one tech stock or one pharmaceutical stock that you put all your net worth into.
That's exactly right. And I think, the benefit with that is to kind of create more of a mutual fund like approach towards investment real estate in the tax deferred status, right, of the 1031 exchange. So that's the real benefit and what makes DSTs, so very unique, especially for investors, property owners who are completely fed up and tired of the day-to-day management. The fact that they can move into more of a mailbox money type investment. I'd say the DSTs are even one rung more passive than the triple nets, because the DST is going to provide, potential monthly cash flow. They'll provide the tax information at the end of the year, so the investor can just pass it right on to their CPA to file their taxes. And they typically, have that 5 to 10 year hold period. So it's really, a passive diversification play, the most turnkey solution for the ultimate end user that wants as much passivity as possible when it comes to their ownership. So that's where we've seen the DSTs work really well for investors, especially here in Southern California. I mean, the actual return on investment from a cash flow perspective compared to other parts of the country is significantly less. Granted, appreciation in Southern California is far greater than other parts of the country. But for, investors that are in that retirement age that are looking to kind of transition away from that active management, they want to kind of enjoy their grandkids, take the vacation they've never been able to take. This is really, I think, more of a lifestyle change for them. And, if they could potentially increase their cash flow, along the way too, it's really a win-win for everyone involved through the 1031 exchange pathway.
Yeah, it offers a lot of benefits. And the other one that I really appreciated is quite a few of my clients, apartment owners, and this could probably span across Southern California, even the whole state, is they're working in investor or family grade kind of investments. Lots and lots of buildings here in Long Beach are built in the 20s and the 30s, C grade stuff, which serves a purpose. But a lot of these folks would never think that they could climb themselves into institutional grade real estate, which with your DST model is very possible.
Yeah, that's another advantage too, is it provides access to a caliber or class of property that you or I, or most property owners in Long Beach or anywhere else in Southern California, for that matter, would never have access to. Right? Quite frankly, we're not going to be able to buy a $75 million Class A apartment property in Dallas, Texas, or a $35 million Amazon distribution facility in Tampa, Florida, right? These are institutional class caliber real estate offerings that are made available to a private accredited, high net worth investor through the structure of the DST, right? You can buy a piece of the multifamily, you can buy a piece of the Amazon distribution facility, a piece of the, $25 million self-storage property, a piece of a dialysis clinic. So it allows really for that diversification, even across class of real estate, and also different property types too, that a lot of investors that we work with, maybe they own, apartment properties, kind of that C-class single family home type rental. They haven't had experience, managing a $35 million Amazon property or a $75 million Class A multifamily, but they don't have to, right? Because they're essentially hiring a DST company to do that for them. So it really takes the burden of kind of having that expertise away from them and giving them access or providing access to that type of real estate all at the same time.
The other thing that I like about your outlet, and I read this as well. So, and let's just frame it up. I gave an example in the start where, I'm nearing retirement, or at least retiring from active ownership. Let's say I got a couple buildings. I got net equity of a couple $1 million, and I don't exactly know where I want to land, right? I'm looking around, I'm looking at some single tenant stuff. I may look at another apartment building out of state. Maybe that's part of my goal too, is I'm tired of the bureaucracy in California. What I did read was, okay, well, hey, go out and hunt some of the uplegs that you may want on your own, but hey, use us as a part of your identification process, so that if one of those things doesn't pan out or look right after you analyze it, you've got us sitting here with some viable options for you. Do a lot of people do that in their exchange?
Absolutely. And that's another major benefit of the DSTs, is the flexibility of the structure itself with respect to the short timeframes involved in the 1031 exchange. So one of the main reasons we find why people don't want to exchange is because they're scared of the failed exchange, right? And really the failed exchange comes within the 45-day identification window. An investor has 45 days from the close of the relinquished property to formally identify or nominate their replacement properties, which in a traditional sense is very difficult to do, right? To source and different acquisitions, whether it's a net lease property or even a replacement, multifamily property that's self-managed. By the time you get through your own due diligence and actually have a firm, contract in place, there certainly is some identification risk that comes with that. So we work with investors, of course, in a primary sense, if DSTs are their primary solution, but we can also work with them as a cover, right? If you're in a $3 million exchange and an investor is able to locate a $2.5 million replacement net lease property that they feel really good about, we can help with the $500,000 difference. If the investor finds a $3 million replacement property that would cover the entirety of their exchange proceeds, if they were to close on it, we can help with a backup ID, right? Nothing is final till the property has actually been closed on. So the DSTs can kind of, move in a number of different capacities. I'm actually working with an investor right now. Today's her 45th day, and she's been trying to buy this Pizza Hut in Ohio. She's got a little over $1 million in equity proceeds. She's got about $100,000 in debt that she has to replace. This is a smaller, Pizza Hut property. Been going back and forth with the seller, and they just haven't really gotten anywhere. So she's going to identify 2 single property DSTs using the 3 property rule, and we're going to, do our best to make a reservation and hold her position in the DST as long as we can, so that if she can't get across the finish line with that acquisition, she potentially would have the ability to consider these 2 DST properties. So I think the DST, if nothing else, can give investors the confidence to go ahead and list their properties for sale, knowing that they have this kind of backstop if all else fails. So we've seen a lot of success with that. And I think now more than ever, with property values where they are, a lot of investors are deciding to sell and exchange and kind of use DSTs in a number of different ways.
I got to thinking, as you're describing this, what would prevent somebody from doing a reverse exchange into a DST?
Yeah, so reverse exchange wouldn't really be needed for a DST. So a DST is set up to allow investors to close into the property within just a few days. DST properties are already owned and closed on by the DST company prior to being offered to the investors. So the mechanism of how they come to be and how they are made available negates the necessity of doing a reverse exchange, because essentially in a reverse exchange you're doing just that. You're buying another property first before you enter the exchange and essentially replacing the proceeds in a more kind of complicated exchange process. The DST property is already owned, the due diligence has been done, it's ready to go. So as long as it's available in an exchanger's identification window, they've read all the information, the private placement memorandum and all that, and are ready to move forward. They can close, like I said, in just a matter of 3 to 5 business days. So it's a very quick closing process.
No, that's awesome. And that's a great piece of information, because my thought just sort of deferred into like a syndication deal where, somebody has something under contract and they're during the due diligence period, they're going to go out and subscribe, get subscription to it, versus this, the train's already moving. All they got to do is hop on it.
That's right. Yeah. And so the DST, there's a fixed capital raise, right? So the DST, we call them the sponsor company, the DST company that's sponsoring the project. As I mentioned, they fronted the capital to close. So they own 100% of it. And then they'll periodically sell off varying degrees of interest, proportionate to the investors coming in and individually closing into the property at various times. So another benefit with that is, as soon as the funds are released from the qualified intermediary and are received by the DST, the credit for closing is awarded that very day. And so the accrual of cash flow in that investment starts that very same day. So when it comes to the short timeframes of the exchange, if we're working with investors in a primary capacity, many times we'll have all of the DSTs completely lined up for them prior to them even entering the 45-day window. So that even within the first week of their 45-day exchange window, they're completely closed into their replacement DSTs and have completed a successful exchange and have moved on to bigger and better things.
Let's say I had, let's just say for fun, I had $1 million worth of debt on the down legs. How's the debt replacement part addressed with the DST?
Yeah, really great question. And I think this is a concept that a lot of people can struggle with initially. It's really not that complex, but essentially there are DSTs that come with prearranged financing. So when the DST company is doing their due diligence and, when they close on the property, they close on the property with a loan that they've already originated, say for 50% of the property's value. So if it's $100 million property, just using simple math, they secure, a fixed interest rate loan from Fannie Mae for $50 million. And that $50 million is a part of that property. It's a part of that investment. And so for the other $50 million, they are seeking to raise that from the investors, from the equity side. So how it works when a DST investor exchanges into that with, let's say, a portion of their $200 million of equity that they have with the qualified intermediary, they automatically assume their portion of the in-place prearranged financing that has already been set up on that DST. So there's no loan approval process. The DST or the loan is secured on the institutional level. So the investors don't have to, sign for loan guarantees or anything like that. There's no credit check. And they essentially get all the benefits of debt without kind of going through that whole process. So if in this example, if an investor were to put $1 million of equity into that DST that has a 50% loan to value, we call it, they're automatically going to be assigned an equal amount of debt as part of that investment. So they put $1 million of cash in, they're going to assume $1 million in debt. So their total purchase in the DST will be $2 million, and that will qualify them from the debt replacement requirement in the exchange.
It sounds like you can check all the boxes to do a perfect exchange. Total amount of dollars needed to be placed and the debt replacement. Let's say I was a single tenant guy, a big one, or selling an alternative type of investment. What would they say that would convince them to go my way versus the DST? I guess, in other words, what are the real downsides or the objections that you end up with your product type?
Yeah, so the two major objections is our lack of control and illiquidity, and the two kind of go hand in hand, which we were talking a little bit about earlier in the conversation. If an investor is wanting to be in the driver's seat, they're wanting to have really active involvement, they're wanting to squeeze every dollar they possibly can out of their investment, then they're probably better positioned to do something on their own, right? To the DST in that situation would probably not be the best solution for them. If an investor is in the stage of life where they're ready to give up that control, and they're willing to for all the kind of benefits we just went over, then the DST might be a good solution to them. Another thing I would add to that is that the DST for, let's say, a net lease guy, someone who's really into owning and operating long-term net lease commercial properties, the DST essentially provides a triple net feel that can be achieved through the ownership of different property types, specifically management intensive property types. So if that's the main kind of motivation is being passive, the DST can allow investors, that this hypothetical investor, to maintain that passivity in their ownership, but also access very management intensive properties, right? From a diversification perspective. So, kind of going back to your original question, it really comes down to, illiquidity and lack of control. I mentioned these properties are typically held for 5 to 10 years. And from start to finish being the property is sold as a whole to a third party. And in the process of the sale, the investors are entitled to their portion of the net proceeds to be able to exchange over again into another DST or back into real estate they own on their own. So the whole 1031 exchange cycle would essentially repeat in the future. But that, for some investors, having the funds kind of in an illiquid position for that amount of time is not ideal for their particular situation.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was reading in the book about what is a typical full cycle as it relates to the exit strategy. So I'm hearing 5 to 10 years. And I guess from what I also read, it's not impossible to exit early, but it's not that easy. So yeah, it sounds like you'd have to be prepared mentally for the full cycle in order to avoid any snags. And you've really almost got to be committed at the outset to run the full cycle, or you may not want to do it.
That's right. There is a secondary market for this type of investment. It is classified as a private real estate security. So because it's held in kind of the private domain, there isn't a publicly traded secondary marketplace for this interest. So it is possible to sell early, but the investor would have to find another qualified investor, an accredited investor, who's willing to make them an offer that they would essentially accept, right? And that's all going to be circumstantially driven, depending on how quickly the investor wants liquidity, how the underlying real estate itself is performing at that time, what the loan term is remaining. I mean, there's a whole host of different kind of reasons that would implicate the direction of that early exit. And what we always tell investors is, the DST selling your interest early it's possible, but it's not advisable. We typically find that investors, if they're committed to the full business plan, which is that 5 to 10 year hold, they're typically going to realize a much greater return on their total investment. And when it comes to liquidity too, many of our investors have easier access to liquidity in other aspects of their investment portfolio, right? Maybe they have a nice, stock portfolio, or they have a retirement account that they can more easily and access that money without going through the brain damage of selling, interest early.
Mhm.
So we quite frankly, we don't, we handle maybe 5 to 10 of these a year. And to put it in context, we do, thousands of transactions, hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars of equity placed. So it is really few and far between. So once again, possible, but not advisable.
Let's leave it there for now. As we've talked about here today, the DST model offers you a lot of flexibility. It can be very viable in your exchange, whether or not you have another up leg selected, you have extra funds that you'd like to kind of complete it perfectly with. It can accommodate the debt placement that you need to replace. So lots and lots more. This is just an introductory, very quick, but what I'm going to do is I'll have the K Properties website on the show notes. They have a lot of educational resources, which I've really enjoyed studying over the last couple of weeks. And there's definitely something here for you if you're moving into a 1031 exchange and you want to move yourself out of active ownership. Matthew, I really appreciate you being here with us today. So again, everybody, thanks for listening to the Everything Apartments podcast. Stay tuned for another episode soon. I'm your host, Eric Christopher.